Hello my guys, welcome to my last wrap up of the summer, in which I actually read quite a bit. I did really well and I am quite surprised with my progress. So in August, I did participate in Battleathon. I co-hosted the House of Snakes and we did not win. We never win. But it's fun. I had a great time, and like I said, I did manage to get quite a bit of reading done, even though that was more to do with external pressures from things like shelve it or scrap it than it really was anything else, if I'm being honest. But we do have 11 books that we are going to be talking about today. So to get straight into our statistics to kick us off, in the month of August, I read a total of 4,198 pages across 11 books, which broke down to an average of 135 pages per day. For the star ratings, it was a little bit on the lower end this month. We had 3 2-star reads, 3 3-stars, and 5 4-stars, breaking down to an average of 3.18 per book. For the demographics, we had just 1 young adult novel and 10 adults. For the formats, I read 5 standardly formatted novels, I listened to 3 audiobooks, and then read 2 ebooks and 1 comic as well. For the genres, I read 4 fantasy romance, 2 fantasy, 2 sci-fi, 1 mystery, 1 paranormal, and 1 romance. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, we have a very mixed bag here, because 4 of the books I read I have hauled in 2024. 2 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024. 2 of them were books I borrowed from my library, 2 were books I read on Kindle Unlimited, and 1 was an audiobook that I listened to on Audible. So getting into those reviews, I did kick off August with a bang by reading Olympus Volume 6 by Rachel Smith. So this is a webcomic that has been bound up into physical copies, and it is a series that I do like to keep on top of. I did fall a little bit behind with Olympus though, as I was waiting until I went to the US, which I did at the end of July, so that I could pick up the Barnes & Noble exclusive edition of this, which in my opinion is so much better than the standard. So this one is a comic series about Hades and Persephone. It is a romantic retelling. It does feature a lot of the gods of Olympus, and it is, in terms of Hades and Persephone, it is a very wholesome slow burn romance, but in terms of everybody else, it does not really shy away from the darker elements of the gods. So there are content warnings in here for things like sexual assault, domestic abuse, child abuse, things like that. I gave this installment of Olympus 4 stars. My enjoyment of this series always depends on how focused on Hades and Persephone it is. I feel like we can have some slower moments throughout the series, but this one I think was a good balance of the romantic relationship between Hades and Persephone and progressing some of the plot lines that we have had going on that started in like volume 1 or 2, where they have kind of caused a problem or a conflict throughout every volume so far, but we are finally kind of resolving them and moving forward a little bit by the time we get to volume 6, which was good to see after it being kind of such a slow plot progression in that regard. But yeah, not one of my favorites. I always rate these like 4 or 5 stars, so it wasn't one of my absolute favorite installments, but I do think it was a very, very good one. I then read the 10th book in the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan for Wheel of Time Along, which was The Crossroads of Twilight, and finally the slog is over. So Wheel of Time, as I'm sure you all know, is a very popular epic fantasy series. It is set in a universe where the same events happen over and over and over again, and we are in this eternal struggle between light and dark. So over recent ages, the dark has been winning a little bit, and in this series we are following this age's dragon reborn, who is a pivotal figure in this battle between dark and light. He always plays a pawn in this battle, and we are following this character as he's kind of pulled to both sides and kind of struggles with his place in all of this. And then we are also following a handful of Taviran in this world, who are people that have the ability to influence the weave of the world and this like repeating pattern of events. So it is well known in this series that there is a slog era. There are debates on where the slog begins, but everybody kind of agrees that 10 is the peak of the slog and it is also the end of the slog. So I was very, very glad to complete book 10. I actually did not think it was as bad as I expected it to be. A lot of people put the focus on Perrin in this book and say that he is responsible for why a lot of like these later books are boring. I personally did not think that he played a great role in this book. Like, he wasn't the dominant character that we followed in this one, and I actually enjoyed this one a little bit more than I have like books 8 and 9. We delved into the Aes Sedai politics in here in a way that we have been in the more recent books, but for some reason I was a little bit more invested in it. Maybe we had a little bit more forward movement in this one, and I actually didn't feel, I do agree that Perrin's storyline in here has gone downhill. He was one of my favorite characters in the first 3 books, and since then he has done very little of interest in my opinion. So it is a little bit of a slog following him, but I didn't think that he was the focus for too much of this book. I did still end up giving this one a 2-star rating. As we know, my opinions, my enjoyment of the Wheel of Time series is quite up and down. While I didn't think that this was the worst book in the series that I've read, it was also by no means the most interesting. So the next book that we're going to read, I'm actually really excited about it, as it is the prequel to the Wheel of Time series, following my guy Lan and also Moraine, who I have missed very, very much. So yeah, book 10, not great, not super memorable, but I'm excited to read everything from this point onwards, because that's where apparently like it's the height of the series, like where the series gets real good. While I may have read 11 books in August, the great thing is that multiple of them were in the same series, so I can kind of condense things together. And the first series that I tackled was the Mortal Fate series by J. Bree. So Shelby or Scrap It threw me a curveball. It picked me a book that was in the stacks, and this is completely my fault because I shouldn't have had it there, knowing that I would have to read 2 prequel novellas before I could delve into book 1. So that is exactly what I had to do. So in August, I read The Scepter and the Sword, and then The Crown of Oaths and Curses, which I do have here, all by Miss J. Bree. So this is a series about a witch and a fae that are fated mates, but their people are at war, so they hate each other. This is a super slow burn series. Some people refer to it as a no burn because up until, well, not even up until, everything that I've read across these 2 novellas and this book pretty much have no romance in them at all. So the 2 novellas in this world, The Scepter and the Sword, are following the origins of these 2 characters before they come together in The Crown of Oaths and Curses. So in The Scepter, we are following our main character, who is called something. We're following our main character, Rook, and she has been sheltered in this forest that has protected her people. So she's really unaware of the scope of the war that is happening between the witches and the fae. So one day when she returns home with her brother, she finds out that her entire family have been killed and her home has been burned down. So she has to step out of this environment that she's been sheltered in her entire life to go and find a seer to tell her her fate. Now in The Sword, we are following our prince, who is called Soren, and he is really, really against the witches because they killed his family. Essentially what went wrong in this world is there is a witch that is clamoring for power, and he has called himself like the leader of the witches or the Witch King or something, and he is uniting but also corrupting all of the witches in this world to fight for him against the fae. Now the fae are obviously, as usual, a long-lived species, but they do not conceive very easily, and on top of that, the witches have put a curse on them that they will not be able to give birth to children. So content warnings in here for things like miscarriages and stillbirths, because none of the fae can carry babies to term, which means that over the years as this war continues, the fae are dwindling, and our main character Soren has been told that his fate is to find his mate and to bring an end to this war. But the problem is that he has to wait, I think, 900 years from his fate being told to him to be able to do this, and throughout this he just has to watch his people suffer, while his uncle, who is sitting as the regent, has also kind of not taken the throne. He is the regent, so he's supposed to have it until Soren finds his mate, but he is not operating in the best interest of the fae people in Soren's opinion. So when Soren finds out that his mate's a witch, all hell breaks loose because he cannot get over his own prejudice to see past the fact that she is a witch, and also understand that it is this one witch and this one sect of witches that is a problem, not the witches as a whole. There are also other problems in this world, in that the witches were the caretakers of the world. The fae also should have been, but they have been neglecting their duties, and so the land is barren, the people are starving, and Soren is trying to solve this problem, but without taken anything our main female character says into account to kind of help him towards his goals. So I ended up giving the first two novellas, I gave them both 3 stars. They're essentially like prologues, like 80-90 page prologues. So you don't really have a lot to go on when it comes to rating them. And in hindsight, now that I've read the first book and the 2 novellas, I would give The Scepter 2, The Sword 3, and then I gave The Crown of Oaths and Curses 4 stars. I really liked the world in here. I loved the slow pacing, although it did frustrate me in parts. I loved that we spent so much time and attention on the politics and the world, and also the different iterations of magic in here and how that can be utilized, how it differs between the witches and the fae. Because while I do love me a fantasy romance story, I love it when the fantasy is really well developed and is not just like a fancy backdrop to place a romance on. What I didn't love about this book is how unmoving the male main character is. So with the animosity between the fae and the witches being so high, when Soren discovers that his witch is a mate, he throws her into the dungeon, like his castle dungeon, and she stays there for most of the book. So it was kind of frustrating to read in that regard, because I felt like the progression was very, very slow within the story, but also the characters. Now, while it is realistic that Soren would have a great deal of prejudice against the witches, based on his history, it does not make it any less tedious to read when he will not give her an inch. And our female main character, Rook, will not explain herself to him and explain how she is different from the rest of the witches, because she knows that he isn't going to believe her anyway. So I kind of got frustrated around the midway point where we had a kind of breakthrough in the plot where Rook did something that really just could not serve any other agenda. Like, to serve her agenda would have been to do nothing, but she acted in a way that benefited the fae, and still that did nothing for the majority of people around her to kind of prove that she's not like other witches, and that everything that they kind of learned about the witches was not potentially like the be all and end all. I am really excited to read book 2 in this series. However, I have heard that it is not as good and that it has a bunch of editing issues, so I am happy to wait a little while before I dive into that. But based on reading this, like, I could have gone straight into book 2, so I'm hoping that by the time I read book 2, the editing issues aren't as bad and some of those like issues have been ironed out a little bit. I'm not super hopeful, but that's currently like the thought train that I'm on. I then read Fancy Lover by Sherilyn Kenyon, which was my Patreon pick for July. This one is the first book in the Dark Hunters series, or the Dark Hunters world as a whole. I know that there is some debate about whether you should start at book 1 or book 2. I think I've heard that book 1 is kind of like a prequel, and then the actual core plot of Dark Hunters starts in book 2. But regardless, this is a paranormal romance that surrounds Greek gods. So in this one, we are following a woman who is called Grace, and she is essentially coerced by her friend to summon a ancient Greek sex slave because her friend thinks that she needs to get laid. And that was my least favorite thing about this. Like, her friend could get in the bin. She really irritated me because our main character doesn't believe in any of this stuff. So like, kind of, I guess, going along with a ritual, not believing in it, is borderline harmless, where her friend pushed her into this and also did believe that this ritual was actually going to summon a sex slave. So our main male character is Julian, and he has been cursed to be a sex slave many thousands of years ago by his brother, and he absolutely hates it. However, he has no choice but to kind of fulfill his task for a 1-month period, and then he is sent back to the book that he was summoned from. So when he arrives in the year like 2002 or whatever, times have moved on. Grace never intended to actually summon him, and she does not want to sleep with a man that she knows nothing about. So Julian is very confused by this, but Grace, after finding out his circumstances and how much he hates being a sex slave, tries to help him and to free him from the book and somehow break his curse. Grace has also experienced a level of sexual trauma herself, so content warnings for that kind of thing in here. It is talked about a lot. And she is also a sex therapist. So I didn't expect this to deal with the heavier topics that it did, and that was very refreshing. I expected her to summon this sex slave and have a grand old time of it with no regrets, but it definitely went in a different direction than I expected it to. I did end up giving this one 2 stars. However, I did say when I was going into it that I was a little bit cautious because I typically don't like paranormal romance, and this to me felt very similarly to a bunch of paranormal romance that I've read before. I did like that the paranormal paranormal element in here was actually based on Greek mythology as opposed to like werewolves or vampires, but the plot to me was sloppy. We had an element introduced quite early in this book that resolved then quite early that I thought was going to be kind of the main conflict, and then we had a bunch of the gods kind of popping in, playing a small part for 2 pages in this kind of crazy conclusion to this book where there are people kind of getting into life or death situations left, right and center for it to then be resolved in the same chapter. So the thing that I don't like about paranormal romance, which is why I also didn't care for this book, is the format of it as opposed to the topic. Like, I don't mind reading books about witches, vampires, werewolves, Greek gods. It is more the 300-page formulaic installments that I don't enjoy, and in that regard this was no different to many of the paranormal romances that I've read and been ambivalent about before. This, aside from when I got to that chapter where the plot kind of got ridiculous, was not overly offensive to me. I didn't hate it and it was actually quite an easy read, but in the same regard I have no real desire to continue on with this series. I may, because I do own book 2, but past that I feel like it would be very unlikely that I'm ever going to think of this series again. While Fantasy Lover was not a book that offended me, All the Feels by Olivia Dade was, and this was another 2-star read for me in August. So this one is a contemporary romance story following a woman who is a therapist. She's like a mental health worker in the emergency room, and she's decided to quit her job. She's looking to do something similar but move on from that, and she has a period of time where she's not going to be working, she's going to be taking a break. So she goes on holiday to Europe and her mother convinces her to meet up with her cousin, who is the producer on a very famous TV show called The Gods of the Gates. There, her cousin makes her work as like a babysitter to the star, or one of the stars of this show, who has got into a bar fight and caused a spectacle. So our main character, Lauren's job is to essentially monitor him, and not in like a therapist way, like she's not working as a mental health professional in this role. She's more operating as a babysitter who, if Alex does anything questionable, she is going to report his actions back to her cousin, and he will potentially get fired or face repercussions for his actions if it in any way damages his reputation or the reputation of the show. So I had heard some not great things about this. I heard that the male main character kind of talks about the female main character in an unflattering way. So I knew that going into it. Definitely true. What I didn't know going into this is that it is a Game of Thrones fanfiction, or more specifically relating to the actors of Game of Thrones and their potential opinions on how season 8 of the show went. We have lots of paragraphs in here kind of alluding to that nature, and in my opinion, based on what I have read, I'm pretty solid in saying that this is a Nikolai Coster-Waldau fanfic, which I do feel weird about. I'm not a fanfiction reader in general, but I feel like publishing, especially when it ends up being published but it's very obvious what the original source material was about real people, does make me feel just a little bit odd. There's a lot of Harry Styles fanfic out there as well, which also makes me feel kind of weird. But this one in particular, like, while I didn't love the subject matter when I found out what it was, I just didn't like it as a romance. It does definitely, our main male character Alex does definitely talk about Lauren in a very unflattering light, and I understand what Olivia Dade is trying to do here. She is trying to empower and represent non-conventionally attractive people in romance, but I feel like there is a way to do that does empower people who aren't conventionally attractive, as opposed to point out their quote-unquote ugliness, because the way that Alex talks about Lauren in here was just so unflattering, and even in elements where she was offended, like the main character was offended by the way that he was describing her, he kind of doubled down and was like, yeah, no, like, I am saying what you think I'm saying, but like, it doesn't matter because I like that. So there's an instance in here, our main character is described as having like a beaky, crooked nose, and he compares her to a bird at one point, which she's offended by because she thinks that he's making a nasty comment about her nose. And he's like, no, like, I don't mean your nose, like, I mean your entire person looks like a bird, but that's all right because I like birds. And I was just like, this man felt like he had very little tact. There is ADHD representation in here as well with our main male character Alex. I am not in a position to say whether that was an accurate or realistic representation of ADHD at all. I personally did not think that it was. I feel like from reading this, I felt like it overplayed the stereotypical characteristics of ADHD as opposed to really delving into any nuance of ADHD, but that is like just solely my opinion. And overall, yeah, this just wasn't a good time. I will never read anything from Olivia Dade again. There's just something about the writing style as well that I felt there are ways that things can be described in a way that makes them more flattering than Olivia Dade does. Like the descriptions are kind of very flat and very blunt for me. It just took me out of the story a little bit, and it's not even necessarily in the way that I felt our female main character was constantly described in an unflattering way. Sometimes it was just like movement or descriptions of places or objects, but the way that Olivia Dade described them just felt just a little off to me. So yeah, Olivia Dade is not for me, and I did not enjoy this book. In August, I also finished the Themis Files by Sylvain Neuvel. So I listened to the audiobooks of this entire series, but I did listen to Waking Gods, and then I don't own a physical copy, but I also listened to Only Human, which is the third and final book as well. So this is an adult sci-fi series about a team of military personnel, engineers and scientists that are assembled to track down pieces of a giant metal robot that have been found buried under the earth, reassemble them and find out why they are there and kind of what their purposes, where they came from. So book one really focuses on that robot and them delving into like what it's made of, why it's there, possible uses that it may have. Book two, Waking Gods, gets a little bit more existential and apocalyptic with it. This is also a first contact with aliens series, but I would say that it only gets super alien-y in book three. So I gave book two 4 stars and I gave book three 3 stars. I felt like I did not know where this series was gonna go when I started it, and it ended up going to a very different place that I expected it to, which I do feel like impacted my enjoyment along the way, because for book two, I wasn't expecting it to get kind of like end of the world crisis-y, but I thought that that was super dramatic and impactful when listening to the audio. We had some plot twists that I didn't expect, and it kept my kind of curiosity up throughout the entirety. Like my curiosity was definitely there, the intrigue was there in book one. It was definitely carried through book two, but when we got to book three, I feel like the anticipation, like the outcome did not match the anticipation for me. And so I was a little bit disappointed with the direction that book three went into, because aside from, like I said, it getting more alien related, it was also more mundane and started to really focus on the relationships between some of our main characters as opposed to the kind of bigger stuff that was going on in the world. And I understand that, and maybe that was a result of our pool of characters growing a little bit smaller, but I feel like when we started this series we were following like official news broadcasts, because everything in here is told in transcripts in some way, but we were following like world organizations, we were following television broadcasts, we were following political and military kind of like addresses into this situation and these robots. And then the more the series went on, the more it whittled down to the actual individuals involved in this whole thing and their relationships with each other, as opposed to more of a worldview, I guess, on it. And I didn't enjoy that as much about it. I felt like instead of the scale getting bigger in each book, it kind of peaked towards the end of book two, and then the scale started getting smaller and smaller, which I didn't really appreciate. It's not what I expected going into this series, and while it not meeting my expectations in that regard is not necessarily a bad thing, I just didn't love the turn that book three took. So I do think that this series is a very enjoyable listen. It is a full cast audio, it has sound effects and everything. I definitely think that is the best way to ingest this series, but sadly I do think that book one was my favorite in this one, and each book book two was still really good, but then book three was like a massive dip for me, unfortunately. Speaking of finishing series, I then finished the entire First Law World today, and also this round, this current iteration of Catch Up Book Club, by reading The Wisdom of Crowds by Jo Abercrombie. And once again, kind of disappointing end to a series for me, because the first book in this series, which I think is A Little Hatred, was my favorite book in the First Law. Yeah, A Little Hatred was my favorite book in the First Law as a whole. And while I knew kind of that we were going to end up in a darker place than this series started. I was still kind of upset when that happened, and we had a lot of character assassination in this one, which once again I kind of did expect from Joe Abercrombie, but that didn't make me any less disappointed to see it come into fruition. So the First Law World is a grimdark series that mainly focuses on a group of characters. Like, and if we go back to the very first trilogy, like, it's quite a mundane start. It's a group of mundane characters that are swept away on this mission and are very much being puppeted by the immortals of the world, and that is a constant throughout. As a universe, it is very political in nature, and the magical elements of it kind of dwindle with every book. I was unsure going into this whether there was going to be more First Law books in the future. I can say pretty much with certainty that there are going to be more First Law books in the future, and having looked into it a little bit, I believe that Joe Abercrombie's plan is to write a new trilogy, which will be starting with The Devils, published next year, before he comes back to First Law, and then the focus of that next iteration will be a little bit more fantastical, which I'm actually quite excited to see. But the rest of the books are more heavily political than anything else. This trilogy in particular is centering on the industrial age and also a workers' revolution that kind of stems from that. But we are mainly following a handful of main characters who are related to characters that we've seen earlier on in the series, who are just trying to navigate the world in this political climate. A lot of them are members of the nobility and the royalty. We don't follow a ton of common people, so obviously this is quite an unstable time for them as the very foundations of their way of life are collapsing beneath them. This one in particular I enjoyed the least in the trilogy, and that is because I felt like we were building up to something for this entire trilogy that happened so fast at the beginning of this book, and then we mainly focused on the aftermath of this event. I felt like the event itself should have been a little bit more poignant, but the aftermath was so boring. It was so much talking in circles and nobody achieving anything, which is the point that Joe Abercrombie is trying to make. And I find this a lot with Joe Abercrombie. I understand the point that he is trying to make, but I feel like the illustration of this point is so tedious to read. And while I was never realistically going to DNF this book, halfway through I could. If this wasn't the final book in a 10-book world, if this wasn't a book club commitment for me, I could have DNF'd this book because I was so bored throughout the middle section. I did find that it had a couple of almost false endings where I felt like it could, like, the book was drawing to a close and then suddenly it didn't and we pivoted and went in a different direction, and that happened multiple times throughout this one like 550-ish page book. And when I knew we were drawing to the end of a series as well, I was kind of like, how many different directions can we take this in, and what is actually the ending of this series going to be? So those are kind of like my main negatives and why this wasn't a favorite from me. I did still give it a low 4-star though, because I feel like this trilogy as a whole has more plot twists than any of the other First Law books, or more impactful plot twists at least, and that has been true of all 3 installments in this series. But there were a couple of instances in here where maybe I would have gotten it, maybe I would have seen it if I'd have been paying more attention, but the plot twists in here truly took me by surprise and were so genius that I have to give Joe Abercrombie credit for that. And I feel like with his writing there is a certain amount of misdirection. Like, so much of the stuff in Joe Abercrombie's books actually amounts to nothing, that when it amounts to something you are taken by surprise a little bit more. But I definitely appreciated some of those, like what reveals when I got to them. I am very sad about some of the characters in here, and there are some characters in here that I used to love that I now hate. There are some characters that I started off loving, ended up disliking heavily, and then ended up loving again. There's some that I've just loved the entire way through, if I'm being honest, and I'm mad about some of the outcomes of these characters. We have characters that I love that like hit rock bottom, and characters that I hate that end up on top, but I don't feel like I can mark that down because I don't like what happened to characters, because that doesn't make like the book bad. It's actually good because it's eliciting an emotional reaction from me, but I'm still not happy about it. I'm still upset about what transpired in this book. And then the final book I'm going to be talking about in this video is the 6th book in the Pretty Little Liars series by Sarah Shepard, which is Killer. This was the best book in the series so far, which I would never expect from like book 6 in a 16-book series. I honestly do not know why I'm loving these books so much, but I am. They're a great time. They're great palate cleansers for me. These do for me what paranormal romance does for other people, and I don't know why I can't get behind it when it's paranormal romance, but I can when it's YA mystery. But I'm having a grand old time, guys. So this, as I'm sure we all know, there was a very popular TV show based on this series of books about a group of teenage girls whose best friend goes missing, and they start to receive, it's like 2 years after she's gone missing, that they start to receive text messages that are blackmailing them, that if they don't do what this anonymous person says, then this person is going to reveal all of their secrets. And then as the books go on, the stakes get higher and it starts to be more like death threats or like people actually getting hurt, as opposed to just like, I'll tell everyone what you did this one time and you'll get in a little bit of trouble about it. So I'm not sure exactly why I enjoyed this one so much more than the others. We are midway through a second story arc at this point. I think that maybe Sarah Shepherd has hit her stride at this point, and we're also diverting from the show a little bit. It is interesting to me because it has always been a little bit different from the show, but I feel like at this point we have similarities, and I can see like what the showrunners of Pretty Little Liars have taken from this and how they've adapted it and woven it into the show. But I'm also being taken by surprise a little bit because things are playing out a little bit differently in the books than they do in the TV show, and I feel like I am a little bit in a false sense of security because I think I know what's going to happen with certain characters, but the book is actually going in a completely different direction than the show takes things. I know I've said in the past plenty of times that this series has a bunch of red flags because of the time that it was published. It kind of promotes and glorifies things, like not glorifies eating disorders, but it talks about them in quite an insensitive way. We have inappropriate relationships with older men. There's also like a student-teacher relationship in here that isn't necessarily condemned. Also like girl hate, fat shaming, that kind of thing. That is still kind of true, but I will say it is less and less as the books go on. And I do feel like that is a reflection of the time. One like concrete thing that I can say about this in that regard is that our main characters, I think it was Spencer particularly, chain smoked at the beginning of this series. And then I think in book 3 or 4, she just suddenly never smoked a cigarette again. She kicked that habit like that. And now it's like cigarettes who. So these books are kind of updating with the times, not necessarily seamlessly because there's no explanation for Spencer just dropping her nicotine habit, but there is definitely like improvement with the years and with the books in this series in that regard as society moves on, which is also kind of interesting to see, being somebody who also kind of lived through that time period and saw those changes happen. Seeing them reflected in this series is a little bit surreal. So these are all of the books that I read in August. I also got 400 pages into Children of Fallen Gods by Carissa Broadbent, which should probably be the first book that I managed to finish in September. I am going to be participating, or I already am participating, in Magical Readathon as well, which is my favorite readathon of the year. So I'm anticipating that September, if all goes to plan, is going to be a pretty hefty reading month for me, which is going to be intimidating for me when it comes to filming my wrap up, but it should bring lots and lots of juicy, cram-packed content for you guys. So down in my comments, let me know if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them. And if you guys would like to let me know that you were here, but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me a green emoji for Killer by Sarah Shepherd. But aside from that, guys, I do hope you have enjoyed this video. Please do not forget to like if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram, and Patreon if you would like to join me on any of those. And that is it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.